Hello, and welcome to the Civil Service World podcast. I'm Suzannah Brecknell, Editor-in-Chief of Civil Service World, and today you'll hear a conversation between me and Kevin Keith, who is Chair of the UK Open Government Network and the UK Multi-Stakeholder Forum. You'll find out what those both are, and we'll have a conversation ranging from children in Oklahoma, through Barack Obama and David Cameron, nitty-gritty policy making, and ending up thinking about how do we tackle some of the challenges facing our societies and the threat of populism that is all across the world. So it's a big conversation, and let's dive right in. Kevin's going to start with a story. So Kevin, we're going to talk about the opportunity that the UK has this year from October chairing the Open Government Partnership. But we're not going to start this year. We're going to start by going back to a group of kids in 1954. Tell me why we're starting there.
It's called the Robbers Cave Experiment, and it was by a famed psychologist called Muzaffar Sharif, called Robbers Cave because it's actually a place in Oklahoma, America. He brought together 22 boys, carefully selected to be identical to each other in social, educational, physical, and emotional fitness. They were all white, Protestant, middle class, and they'd never met before. And this is key. But they were divided into two separate camps. They called themselves the Rattlers and the Eagles. And members within each team got to know each other and form very strong bonds. Now, the experiment went that in the second week, they started to know of each other's existence. And immediately, one team thought of the other as outsiders or intruders, those boys at the end of the camp. The experimenters also arranged a baseball game. And within minutes, insults flew between one side to another. And in the next few days, relationships deteriorated. Flags from the opposing camp were burnt at night. Rocks were hurled. Fistfights broke out, and the bonds that they'd formed could not be broken. Another interesting insight, what they found is that the only way they could reduce conflict between these two sets of boys, not necessarily through fun games, but through activities, was when they worked on common goals. It was what Sharif called a superordinate goal, challenges that required everyone's contribution to solve. So why am I telling this on Civil Service World podcast? Well, I'd say three reasons. First is because open government is a cultural change. It's a culture of governance. And the only really way we truly affect culture is by stories. So that's why I always try and kind of start with a story. Second is because it recognises the importance of bonds. And so much of open government, this notion of policy co-creation, government, civil society, and other actors all together, is that you start at the beginning of the process together, you form those bonds, and you go on that journey together. I think the third part, and it particularly relates to the rebuilding of trust, is this notion of a superordinate goal. So often in civil society, we'll say to government, look at the plummeting trust rates, look at, research here, this research here. But in truth, it's something that we have to solve together. Everyone collectively has to really work on this issue of trust. And that is, again, where I would suggest open government comes in.
Interesting, you were sort of talking about the different facets of open government. Well, perhaps it's worth clearing up at the beginning is what is open government. I know perhaps from my professional perspective, I think of it around transparency, around publication of information, but also around that kind of working in the open concept around we're talking about what we're doing and we are explaining why we're doing it. You obviously are immersed in the concept of open government and the frameworks and the structures around it. So give us a kind of bird's eye view. What is open government?
Yeah, so the strict definition, or what the OECD define it as, is a culture of governance based on the principles of transparency, accountability, integrity, and stakeholder participation. The Open Government Partnership, which I'm sure we'll talk much more about sort of participatory aspects, the transparency and accountability. I often try and use a bit more kind of maybe common language, and essentially it's how people can see, shape and scrutinise government. It's as simple as that, really. The reason why it maybe does not have the sort of awareness as maybe some other initiatives is that I often hear ministers talk about being open, and you'll hear people talking about being, transparent, and they'll talk about being accountable. But the key thing with regards to open government is this notion of it being a culture of governance. It's a strategic kind of almost a way to change the system. The difference between what we do and these sort of occasional references here and there is that we actually join all of those components together. Without transparency, you can't just have the accountability and the participation side. If you just have the participation side without the transparency and accountability, you won't necessarily see the kind of systemic change that's required in order to rebuild public trust in institutions. So that's really kind of why we have those definitions and why we really focus on those principles.
And you say we there, and I obviously at the beginning said you're the chair of the UK Open Government Network. Who are they? What do you do?
There are kind of three main sort of areas of focus. One is the sort of domestic civil society side. The second is the domestic government side, and the third is the international partnership. So on the domestic civil society side, the UK Open Government Network, well, we do three things really. First is that we very much convene civil society to engage in conversations with government on open government. And we try and do that through networks, we think about different geographies, we think about people from different backgrounds to those who were affected by policy. So we really try and kind of connect people to reform. We connect civil society to government. The second thing is we celebrate reform, we scrutinize reform, we seek to sort of advocate for reform as well. So we kind of have that. And then the third part is really to sustain reform. You'll find in this area, and I suppose across civil society and charities and the like, is that often momentum ebbs and flows. Speaking to colleagues in the US at the moment, for example, civil society over there, it's a very difficult time. Our third priority is really about trying to sustain reform, because we know that in order to drive cultural or systemic change, it requires a concerted effort always, That idea of sustaining reform is arguably should be growing reform, because we think this agenda is more important than ever. We think that all of the kind of indicators in terms of trust and the benefits of governments working with civil society are there. And so we have that third objective around sort of sustaining reform.
I hear people talking about often within government how hard it is to drive change and to drive reform. So actually having that external force to sustain and grow reform, while it may feel prickly, also, I think some people within government would welcome that kind of external energy and that external support to keep going with reform agendas.
Completely. And the other thing just to point out as well is that we kind of have a very direct relationship with the UK government. There are also, equivalent networks in Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland, growing communities in and around Glasgow and Greater Manchester, because all of these, with the exception of Wales, I should add, are what are known as open government partnership local members. So the UK is a national member and those other areas are local members. So we also kind of bring together a voice that's working at different levels of government, Glasgow City Council, Greater Manchester Combined Authority, Northern Ireland Assembly, Scottish Government, and of course the UK government as well. So we have this really kind of interesting multi-layered sort of approach to reform too.
You've helpfully mentioned there the next thing I want to ask you about, which is the open government partnership. And so you also spoke about the fact that there are trends, growing indicators of the importance. So there's a kind of wider strategic importance for open government in terms of trust in democracies and the way government functions. But there's also a really timely and very specific reason why right now is an interesting time to be talking about this in the UK, which is we're going to be chairing Open Government Partnership from October. So let's start with, what's the Open Government Partnership?
So it was set up in 2011 by then President Barack Obama. It was his sort of initial idea. He took to it a UN assembly, had various conversations on the side of various meetings, and it led to the Open Government Partnership being formed. The UK was actually one of the founding members. There were 8 countries initially, and it's since grown to roughly, over 70 countries around the world. And I mentioned as well, I think sort of about 3 or 4 years ago, OGP Local, Open Government Partnership Local, was also created, and that includes 150 other members, everyone from, I mentioned in the UK, are OGP Local members, but there's also, the likes of New York City and various other places all around the world as well. So there's growing partnership. I think it covers something like 2 billion people in total from various sort of governments. The way in which they all signed up was initially signing a charter, which very much underlines those principles I've mentioned. It's high on integrity. It's about trust, accountability, listening and engaging in a meaningful way citizens in how they're governed. At the time as well, there was also a big push around technology and embracing technology. It felt like a moment when technology could really advance this agenda, and it sort of took off from there. And like I say, rapidly grew from 8 countries to 70 plus countries that it is today.
As you said, that moment when technology felt like a big driver and positive in open government and trust, and now it's a lot more complex, that picture. But before we kind of dive into some of the themes about why it matters and how our listeners in the civil service and wider civic society can kind of take advantage of this moment, one last bit of sort of context setting to make sure we all understand. I also said you co-chair the Multi-Stakeholder Forum alongside Cabinet Office Minister. So what is that? How does it kind of feed into that government and civil society relationship?
It's really interesting in the Multi-Stakeholder Forum. The Secretariat is in the Cabinet Office. It's co-chaired by myself and often Cabinet Office Minister or a senior civil servant in the Cabinet Office. And it brings together many of the actors I mentioned from civil society, but also typically around 12, 13, 14 different leads across the government too. And it has a number of roles. One, it has an oversight role in terms of any existing plans which are produced between government and civil society. So various commitments are produced between the both parties. So it has that oversight role. But increasingly, what it's also doing is it's having this sort of leadership role in terms of open government across government. I've mentioned before about it being a culture of government and about it being systemic, and often at times open government can feel like a project within government, and really you don't get anywhere if that's the case. So what we're trying to do with the Multi-Stakeholder Forum is, yes, have oversight of existing plans and processes which engage government and civil society, but also have a leadership role as well across government and try to bring in other areas of government where activities taking place in and around open government. So, I can give you some examples. There is the Civil Society Covenant currently being discussed with DCMS, engaging charities in terms of how they can work together. There is a Participatory Methods Forum, roughly housed within Housing and Local Government, but again, it's bringing together civil servants who are interested in Participatory Methods Forum, so we have representation there. I've mentioned that the Secretariat is the Cabinet Office, but increasingly as well, FCDO are sort of really important in this space, obviously with the co-chair role, increasingly so, but they're also very active and, provide us with briefings. It's a really useful and constructive meeting. And we certainly have spent a bit of time trying to create sort of what we call like a psychologically safe space, basically enabling people to be able to say what they want to say. We keep the conversation constructive. We don't interrupt each other. We listen to each other. We try and avoid acronyms, all of that sort of stuff. But it's actually taking some time to get to a place where I think hopefully people who are in the Multi-Stakeholder Forum can talk freely and constructively. And we've had over the years, we've had some really quite challenging conversations where not necessarily either party gets 100% what they want, but collectively would agree that this is how we move forward.
So let's think about, why should open government be integral to civil servants' work? Why is it important to our listeners? Should we start with this kind of question of public trust in institutions? And we read about it all the time, this kind of crisis of democracy or whatever, however you're going to frame it.
Yeah, and it's key. The OECD has done information, and it does research on trust levels all the time, and it particularly looks at the notion of trust within governments. And all the evidence shows that currently the average is around 40% of people trust governments. This is within the OECD. But those governments who actively engage citizens in conversations around policy or where citizens feel connected to their governments in terms of policy, that trust level increases to something like 60%. And so the evidence is really there that shows the more people feel connected, the more people can shape those policies, actually the trust grows. I also should point out, I mentioned earlier about this notion of trust being something that we all have to contribute to. It's not just government, it's kind of government and civil society, but it's us all as individuals as well, trying to find ways that we can actually build commonality and build a sort of shared sense of what we're trying to do here and give everyone a sense of agency. So to me, yeah, it's absolutely, it's crucial. It's always context specific. You can find that trust sort of goes up and it goes down, but from a strategic and a sort of cultural perspective, it's always useful to kind of have it kind of front and center. And the first question that would come out is that, who can we engage in terms of stakeholders on this particular policy area? And if people are thinking in terms of that mindset, I think it's very helpful.
I'm sure our listeners will think, yep, they're in public service, see the value of that kind of trust in government and of government as a good force for good. But actually, let's take it a little bit more day to day. What's going to be worrying them in their everyday life? They're going to be worrying about the policy outcomes they've been asked to work on. They're going to be worrying about money. Does it fit into that, or is it just airy-fairy, like good principles?
No, and it has to. And this is one of the things about open government generally, and even the Open Government Partnership. Yes, it starts with these lofty principles, but we then work on national action plans. It's always had to have this kind of common strand between the principles and the implementation. But in terms of the policy case, it makes better policy. If you speak to the people in government who are working on open contracting, it's called, or procurement, the insight and the different levels of experience that they had through working with civil society on some of the reforms that they were making were hugely beneficial in terms of the policy development itself. So there is that kind of knowledge that doesn't necessarily just exist within Whitehall. And I come back to, I mentioned the sort of civil society covenant earlier, working with charities in a way that I imagine that they will as well. Some of those charities have lived experience and stories as well, which can also bring policy to life in a way which, can again influence the policy development itself. There is an efficiency sort of argument. You mentioned the money as well, in terms of the more you engage with stakeholders, it's more likely that you'll get the policy right kind of first time. I know it's not as simple as that, and there's always political pressure and things have to be done quickly. But the more you give space to speak to the people who are impacted on the policies, the various stakeholders, the more you'll become aware of challenges within that policy process. And something else happens as well. You probably find that if you go on that journey together with those stakeholders and with, civil society, that you'll have someone kind of championing your corner as well. So when inevitably a policy does hit a hurdle, people will understand because they've kind of contributed to that initial process.
I want to pick up, because you've mentioned it, this National Action Plan. In the spirit of avoiding kind of phrases that are not necessarily evident what it means, let's dig into practically what is in a National Action Plan. Give us a bit of an idea about what that looks like.
So the National Action Plan historically is a plan which usually is published every 2 years. We have published, the UK government has published, alongside civil society, 6 national action plans so far. And they are roughly once every 2 years or so. They are a process of co-creation whereby there is almost like a call for evidence. There's a conversation in terms of what would civil society like to engage with, what would government have the capacity to be able to engage with, and then the two are joined. There's a co-creation process out of which then comes policy commitments. And this is what the Multi-Stakeholder Forum has oversight of. And the UK is quite a significant player in many of the sort of global policy commitments which are taken up by other countries, but things like beneficial ownership. Beneficial ownership is essentially the true owner of an asset, particularly in the UK's instance, it's properties, in parts of London. Having an understanding of who the true owner is can help deal with money laundering, various other things. So beneficial ownership was something which originated in the UK National Action Plan. The idea of algorithmic transparency and people being able to look into and understand algorithms, again, is something which was initiated by the Open Government Partnership. The interesting thing with the UK at the moment as well is we've just kind of pioneered a new way to put together action plans. Typically, we have the call to action, we all get together, we co-create, we publish the plan at the end of the year. What we're looking to do is kind of be a bit more responsive to technological change, be a little bit more agile, and start to work almost on a rolling action plan basis, so that often people in government say, well, we would have liked to have had something in the National Action Plan, but this policy we're working on, it's way out of sync. We've got these timescales, you've got these timescales, and we can't marry the two. So we're moving to hopefully something which is a bit more of a rolling action plan so that we can incorporate commitments as and when. So it kind of fits hopefully a little bit more with government's timelines and timescales, so that we're about to have the next kind of call for evidence. And there will be hopefully lots that come out of that in terms of civil society and government, and we can do that kind of matchmaking thing and hopefully work on some commitments. But if in, say, 3 months' time, there is a new area or a new aspect of government policy which fits within open government, and much of it does, then that could potentially also be incorporated in terms of this process. We could look at how we bring civil society into that, look at the sort of co-creation, and hopefully just again make it feel much more strategic, much more about a culture of governance rather than a tactical plan within government. So that's kind of key. Just some other things as well which kind of make this process a little bit different is there's an independent review mechanism. So we have the National Action Plan, and there's an independent side to it too. So it's reviewed by a third party, which again is something which it's a different level of accountability, but is something which is really interesting in terms of what governments sort of subscribe to as well. We're in a very different place now than we were 3 or 4 years ago. We have stabilized much of these processes. 3 or 4 years ago, we were sort of at risk of being called inactive because various plans were delivered late. And there was the pandemic and things like that. But the process, the levels of participation didn't meet the necessary standard things. So we have worked quite hard in the last sort of 3 or 4 years to really get all of this back on track. We work heavily with the Civil Service Strategy Unit in the Cabinet Office, Government Commercial Function, done some great work on the open contracting. And I've mentioned the FCDO, who are doing some great work in terms of general coordination around the co-chairing, on the aid transparency commitment, and on work with the UN around anti-corruption work as well. And the Home Office also do some fantastic work with the Joint Anti-Corruption Unit, working with the Anti-Corruption Coalition, which is a civil society network. We've worked sort of quite systematically to strengthen this process. And now it is quite exciting because it does feel like we have almost like a new domestic process. We've obviously got this international moment as well. For many of us, it kind of feels like we really have got to ensure that more people across government are aware of this.
I think that's a good point to move into the international moment that we've got. Briefly, what does it mean in practice to be chair of the OGP?
It means that you can set an agenda. From the UK's perspective, they can choose various areas that they can then kind of seek to prioritise. And I mentioned that there are 74 countries and 150 kind of local governments as well. If the UK says, well, as part of our co-chairing, we will prioritise these thematic areas, it could be misinformation, disinformation, it could be illicit finance, and there is an illicit finance summit coming up in June, I should add. It could be civic space, which has also been mentioned. If the UK government says we are going to prioritise these areas, then what you will find is that other countries will also look in and focus on those areas too. Yeah. So it's a real opportunity to demonstrate leadership in aspects of open government. Obviously, I keep using the phrase open government, but I'm ultimately talking about democracy in many respects too. So it's about real kind of leadership. The reason why we think it matters domestically is that you have the title of being OGP, sort of co-chair internationally, but the leadership really comes through what you do domestically. That's it's always about leading by example. We know that as individuals. So from our perspective as well, we think it's an opportunity to, again, work with the government to say, this can be our best national action plan yet. This can be the moment when we really kind of embed this as a strategic approach across government. You get pockets of open government taking place. They have brought in an independent ethics and integrity commission. Some people say it needs more independence, currently still reports to the PM. But nonetheless, they brought it in. That's a positive step forward. They've recently announced that the Electoral Commission will be independent again. That's very much welcome. They've brought in a duty of candour, or the Hillsborough Law, which again, whilst I know it's sort of having issues as it travels through the various houses, again, most people, that's a really good thing. There's various other things as well. I mentioned the Civil Society Covenant. The government's doing things, but open government is about saying, let's join dots here. Let's make this a strategy. Let's make this a kind of culture of government. The Prime Minister on the steps of Downing Street said trust will be the defining issue of this government. Yeah. He often says the word open. I remember when he was launching the AI strategy and he talked about, it's based on our values of being open. And I often think just open government. But he will often say, he will use all of the language of open government without necessarily saying open government as a strategy. So I think that there's a real opportunity to really join some dots and embed and connect the values of political leadership, the principles of open government to delivery on the ground, which evidence suggests will build trust.
What would you, if we look back, is it a year we hold the chair?
Yeah.
So we look back at the end of 2027, what would success look like? What would you want to look back on from the chairmanship of the Open Government Partnership? And then what would you like from the civil service to help facilitate that success, to make that likely?
When the UK government was last co-chair of the Open Government Partnership, this is going back to 2013, and there was a summit in London, and the then Prime Minister David Cameron sort of talked about a transparency revolution. And I've since kind of, because of the world and because of what's happened since, and sort of what's felt like revolving door politics at times, to me, it's not about transparency revolution. It's about transparency sort of restoration, if you like. It's about bringing all of this right front and center again. In terms of success, there was very much a feeling in the UK and globally to an extent, going back sort of 2011, 12, 13, 14, 15, of this agenda being at the core of innovation, of being at the core of who we are in terms of our values, of being really kind of impacting on the way in which a government operates, and crucially the way in which it engaged citizens. It felt like, it was a sort of growing culture within government. And over the years, it's just kind of become a bit kind of within government. If there is a sense after a year of being the global co-chair again, that this feels right at the top of government again, and we will all feel that will be a huge success. I think that there are other opportunities within thematic areas where the UK government and FCDO are absolutely doing some strong work in this area, but you could easily see how the UK government could take a leading role in some of the issues around information integrity, whether it's misinformation, disinformation, media literacy. There is a whole kind of issue with regards to how we create and distribute information online, and it's a growing problem impacting pretty much most aspects of life. So again, there are thematic areas where you think the UK government could, make a difference. Illicit finance is another obvious one as well. If the UK can galvanise really kind of strong, ambitious commitments that we sort of lead on domestically, but that are taken up elsewhere, I think that would be hugely beneficial. And I've talked a lot about the kind of upstream stuff. Wouldn't it be great as well that in addition to people like myself being really happy because we feel connected and we can see the thematic commitments, and wouldn't it be great if actually people, if that trust indicator started to go the other way? Wouldn't it be amazing if actually trust between government and various institutions did start to go the other way and people did start to trust some of the policies which impact on their lives? That's ultimately what all of this is about. As much as we've talked about policy and process and commitments and national action plans, ultimately what we're trying to do is enable the person who goes into citizens' advice and says, what's going on? I can't understand why my bills have gone up. And someone's able to say it's because there's an algorithm and it's made a decision about your life that you don't understand. Or, it could be a small charity that doesn't feel that they can bid for various contracts because they don't have the skills, but actually through procurement reform, they're enabled now to have a seat at the table and get involved in some of the government contracting. It could be the family charity who has, supported families, but now increasingly is finding itself having to fight disinformation around anti-vax, or that kind of stuff. Wouldn't it be great if all of this ultimately filters right down into society and we all feel moving in the same direction?
I always try and finish by asking guests, a piece of advice or, a final thought for our listeners. So our listeners in the civil service, what's your ask of them? I mean, those goals you've set out are quite long term, but in the next 18 months, when we have this opportunity where you feel actually the open government partnership and this multi-stakeholder framework, the structures around that are in a good place. So it's a moment, a tipping point, as you said. What would you ask of our listeners to help push it in the right direction?
We'll have a meeting with our minister in the not too distant future in a few weeks, actually, and we'll be sort of saying to the minister, Chris Ward, we'll be relying on him to spread the word at a ministerial level, and hopefully that then filters down to department heads. And we'll also be getting the word out across government via a call for evidence. Again, just be mindful that this work is there, it exists. The likelihood is that you can contribute to it. Most policy which is being developed or thought about can be co-created, and there are networks of civil society out there that can give you knowledge and policy expertise. We have academia heavily involved in all of this process as well. So you get a kind of different level of insight at the very beginning of that policy development process. There are existing networks within government you should keep a lookout for. I mentioned the Participatory Methods Forum. They're connected into this on the sort of participation side. Government isn't necessarily something done to people. It's something done. It's something that is shared. And there is an open government team within the strategy unit within the Cabinet Office. They will be doing significant outreach across government as well. Obviously, people are more than welcome to reach out to myself, and the best email is just at opengovernment.org.uk. And then within the Cabinet Office, open-government@cabinetoffice.gov.uk. A small team there on this agenda. As I mentioned right at the start, we all have to have a sort of a joint responsibility in terms of trying to address issues around trust and trying to really make this a sort of moment of systemic and cultural change. So just be an active player and just look out for the information that comes your way. See how you can get involved.
We've touched on a lot of topics. We've got some resources there, which we'll pop in the episode notes if people didn't jot them down. Let's go back to where we started, Kevin. Let's go back to those groups of young boys in Oklahoma. I hope people have, as we've had this discussion, they will have picked up some of the relevance around shared goals, around, building connections helps to prevent that kind of human drive towards conflict almost. But when you tell that story, can you pick out a little bit more for us why you tell it? And who do you think of as the rattlers and eagles in the context of open government? Is it all of us? Is it government and society?
It is very much a societal reflection, but it kind of as well makes the point that trust is context specific. Our politics was once determined by socioeconomic issues, and increasingly it's dominated by socio-cultural issues. We're all kind of rattlers and eagles, divided by charismatic populists and supported by social media algorithms that expand the definition of them and shrink the definition of us. Culture wars replace collective action at times. And populists understand this. Something else that charismatic populists understand is a discourse that empowers. And in the words of Dutch political scientist Cas Mudde, people are not just waiting for the simple solution, they're waiting to be empowered. That's something that I think many populists know. They know they're not expected to do everything, but they give people a feeling or a sense of agency that they're an active participant in their own fate. It's something we have to be acutely aware of. And so if we can form those bonds, whether it's government and civil society, or we didn't talk much about social cohesion, but if we can just find those spaces, those shared spaces, those commonalities, the world will be a much better place for it. And it matters in terms of policy development. It matters in terms of governance. In my view, it matters in terms of most aspects of life.
Thank you, Kevin. That's been such an interesting conversation. We've moved from really granular issues around open contracting and nitty-gritty bits of policy into some of those really big thought-provoking principles and things that we can live our lives by. Thank you for sharing your time and your insight with the Civil Service World podcast. Thank you to our listeners. And if you are not already subscribed, do so that you can hear the next interesting conversation we'll be having straight in your feed.